Joining me now is Brad Smith, the president and vice chair of Microsoft. He sits at the intersection of technology and society, working on issues such as cybersecurity, environmental sustainability, and human rights. He's also the co-author of a great book. I love this book, Tools and Weapons, The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age. And just by way of disclosure, Microsoft is supporting these conversations and a more perfect union, and we're grateful for that. But Brad, I am so grateful to talk to you because your book is the first that I have read that actually invites government to regulate, to kind of come in and say, you know, we're a technology company. All of us are developing technologies of the future, but we need scaffolding around that. Can you tell us what your primary goal in Tools and Weapons is in describing for the public what choices we have?
Well, sure, and thank you, Steve. It's always great to be with you, and in part, it's encapsulated in the title. Digital technology today is a tool and it is a weapon. It's a tool that helps us solve just about every problem we grapple with societally, but it has also been weaponized, literally weaponized in the form of cyber weapons and cyber attacks. And it's also contributing to many of the problems that ail us. When you look at the broadband divide, when you look at the digital skilling divide, these exacerbate every other income and economic and social divide that we worry about. So we've reached a point societally where I think we just have no alternative but to combine a healthy market with the kind of regulation that will ensure that we continue to have a healthy market.
Now, you have just released a new edition of the book, and you have 3 new chapters, one on cyber attacks, one on digital sovereignty, one on tech in a pandemic. And I guess the question I have, when we've seen the SolarWinds attack, we've seen attacks on American infrastructure from digital nefarious players. We have a sense that while we're all online now, as caused by this pandemic, that there are concerns about privacy. There's a fragility out there, and then people's nerves are on edge. And I guess I'm wondering, in the world of 5G, AI, big data, everything coming down the pike that you write so eloquently about, are we ever going to feel secure and stable in that? Or are we all going to be on edge, for the next generation of living? How do we get to feeling safe in this digital space?
Well, I definitely think we can make ourselves far safer and more secure and more comfortable and confident with technology than we are right now. We added a new chapter. We made it the first chapter on the SolarWinds related issues. We thought it was important to tell the inside story of what we had gone through at Microsoft late last year and really bring to life the sophistication of the cyber attacks we're seeing, but then use that as a jumping off point to talk about the types of solutions that are needed. And I think that's where your question leads us. We do need new solutions across the board. When it comes to cybersecurity, we need the tech sector to do more, but we need governments, we need Congress to legislate and do more.
What are your insights, Brad, on what we should be doing to make our democracy more stable when it comes to voting? Which is also another, digital, I would say sacred exercise of our citizen rights. But we're, in an age where this again is in the digital space, and there have been concerns about, the security of that system. But as we think about the fragility of democracy, what thoughts do you have?
Well, I think we need to start by really understanding the problem better. We rewrote the whole chapter on social media, and we included a lot of other new material on the cyber threats to electoral processes. I think I would start with this. I don't think it's an exaggeration to think of the foreign-based technology threats to our democracy as the most formidable threats this country has faced since the end of World War II. I think you need to look at both cyber attacks and the potential tampering with elections and disinformation campaigns that come from abroad and put them together. Because I think that if you're sitting in St. Petersburg or Moscow, that is what people are thinking about. And I just would ask people to do 2 things. First, what's the great miracle of 2021? I think it was the invention of these amazing vaccines and the ability to distribute them to the entire country. What's the great tragedy of 2021? It is misinformation and even disinformation that has caused tens of millions of Americans to decide not to put a free shot into their arm, even though it could save their life and keep their loved ones safe as well. And I think we're going to need to dig in. I suspect that by the time we do, 2 years from now, we will find that just as with disinformation in elections, there has been foreign influence for disinformation for vaccines.
Thank you for that. It's very powerful commentary on our times. But Brad, I'm also interested in another goal of yours that I think as long as I've known you, probably a couple of decades, you've been concerned about how do we disrupt education in a way to make it more successful, more inclusive across the board so that you have fewer gaps in the American educational story for all Americans. And on top of that, kind of looking at how we connect Americans, create a much more inclusive connectivity to every community in America. And I guess my question is, you've been at this for as long as I've known you. What's in the way of success? What is keeping us, finally, when we talk about connectivity and devices and digital literacy, we've been at it for a long time. What's stopping progress?
Well, I think the number one thing that's stopping progress right now is the inability to pass an infrastructure bill in Congress, because I think an infrastructure bill is of fundamental importance for getting done what this country needs to do. Imagine what it would mean if kids went to school but didn't have electricity at home. There's no way they could study in the evening the way their peers did. But every day we accept in America where some kids leave the school building to go home where they have broadband and a PC and others do not. What would it mean if we had half of the schools in this country that were teaching physics and biology, but the other half were not? Well, that is the reality for computer science today. So in short, what we really need to do is invest in digital skilling, get more skilling into our schools and our community colleges and the higher ed system, and make broadband as ubiquitous as electricity. If we can do those two things, and the infrastructure bill would contribute to both, then we would take what I think would rightly be a giant leap in the direction that we need to head.
And then just finally, Brad, another area that I know you're thoughtful about in your book was really a clarion call to action, if you will, and to widening our aperture on what the challenges are. I'm interested in the international scene. I'm interested in what China's doing, what India's doing. What are some of our, sometimes we collaborate with these countries on things like climate. Sometimes we compete with them on technology and trade and other issues. But I'm interested in what we need to do to get right and how we stack up vis-a-vis China, and what your concerns are on the state of affairs in America when it comes to investing in science, when it comes to progressing in these areas that China is obviously moving very fast on.
It's a fascinating unfolding dynamic. It's why we rewrote the chapter and updated it on China, then added this new chapter on Europe. We're obviously seeing a widening split between the United States and China, including on technology issues. I don't think that necessarily means a complete separation, but the Pacific Ocean feels wider in 2021 than it did 5 years ago. But I think there's another point that is really important for Americans to start to grapple with. We live in a world where there are these two major countries with enormous technology talent and a technology-based ecosystem, economy, and industry, the United States and China. But we don't live alone. I mean, technology strength is distributed more broadly. And even more than that, we almost have entered a world that I would say is akin to having a number of regulatory great powers. You look at the European Union, you look at the United Kingdom post-Brexit, you look at India, and then there are a number of other countries that are really punching above their weight in terms of regulatory influence around the world. I think of Australia and South Korea as two examples of countries that just this year have been leading with new innovations in the legislative and regulatory space. And I think sometimes the mistake that people in the US and especially in Washington, D.C. make is that we spend so much time focused on ourselves that we fail to recognize that when you're talking about a global technology, you're really talking about global interaction among legislators and regulators.
Brad, I'm going to sneak one last one in because you and I have also talked in the past about diversity, gender diversity, racial diversity, and the technology community in which, essentially, let's just be honest, white guys dominated the scene. You've been very committed in Microsoft to changing this. I know that, but I'd love to get your perspective on whether your industry has finally gotten it and whether you're beginning to see, on boards, in engineering rooms, throughout these companies, a more diverse workforce, or do you think there's much more to be done?
Well, there is a lot more to be done, but I feel that things are moving in a better direction than they were, say, 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. I think there's an appreciation for the importance of diversity that is more broadly held in this industry in tech than, say, 10 or 20 years ago. But more than that, I think we're finally taking the kinds of steps that are turning good intentions into more positive action and some encouraging results. Here at Microsoft, I feel the watershed moment was about 5 years ago when we started to tie some of the executive compensation to measurable progress. And I think it's like any other part of the economy. You get what you pay for, you manage what you measure. Once we started to measure this, once we started to pay for good performance, we started to see improvement. It's going to take lots more sustained effort. This is not an issue that can be, frankly, surmounted in a year or two. But if we just stay focused each and every year, then what I've learned is over the course of a decade, it's amazing what you can accomplish.
Well, Brad Smith, President and Vice Chair of Microsoft, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to tell our audience, I'm not trying to be nice to Brad, I'm not trying to be nice to Microsoft, but do read this book, Tools and Weapons, The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age. It's one of the most important books I've read in recent years. So thank you so much, Brad, for joining us.
Thank you, as always.
Wow. Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. A very big thank you to Microsoft and to Southern Company for their support, and to all of you attendees. These have been great conversations. I'm loving this, and we're going to do it again tomorrow. A big thank you to Bob Cusack, the Hill's editor-in-chief, for joining us today. Great interviews. For those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, we'll have the video up of all of these encounters on our website shortly. Make sure to join us tomorrow starting at 11:30 a.m. Eastern for day 3 of A More Perfect Union. We'll be joined by ACLU's Deborah Archer and Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement. Until then, I'm Steve Clemons. Be well.